The tone shifts quickly. Macaulay Culkin hesitates as Joy Behar steps in, and the tension starts to build. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? One that shifts from lighthearted nostalgia into a serious, uncomfortable exchange that nobody in the studio quite saw coming. Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It starts the way many segments do on The View: relaxed, conversational, and designed to ease both the audience and the guest into the discussion. The panel is seated, the tone is friendly, and there's a sense of familiarity that longtime viewers would recognize instantly. On this particular episode, the guest is Macaulay Culkin, widely known for his early success and, more recently, his return to public life with a more measured, reflective presence. As the segment opens, the hosts, including Joy Behar, begin by revisiting Culkin's early career. The conversation touches on his childhood fame, the pressures that came with it, and how he has managed to navigate adulthood after such an intense start in the spotlight. Culkin appears calm and composed, offering thoughtful responses without rushing, occasionally smiling but mostly maintaining a grounded demeanor. At first, everything unfolds exactly as expected. The questions are familiar, the tone is respectful, and the audience responds warmly to moments of humor and nostalgia. Culkin shares a few reflections about growing up in the public eye, speaking in a way that feels honest, but not overly revealing. There's a noticeable effort on his part to keep things balanced, acknowledging the past without letting it define the entire conversation. Joy Behar leans in at one point, shifting slightly in her seat, and introduces a question that subtly changes the direction of the discussion. Her tone remains conversational, but there's a sharper edge to the topic. She begins to ask about the broader impact of child stardom, not just on Culkin himself, but on the industry as a whole. It's the kind of question that often leads to more serious commentary, and you can sense the panel preparing for a deeper conversation. Culkin listens carefully, nodding as she speaks, but his posture becomes a bit more upright. It's a small change, but noticeable. He takes a moment before responding, choosing his words deliberately. His answer starts off measured, acknowledging that the industry has changed over time, but also pointing out that not every experience fits into a single narrative. At this stage, the exchange is still respectful, but there's a slight tension beginning to build, not from anything overtly confrontational, but from the difference in perspective that's starting to emerge. Behar follows up with another question, this time referencing public perceptions and media portrayals of former child actors. Her phrasing suggests a more generalized view, one that implies certain patterns or expectations. Culkin's response is where the shift becomes more apparent. He gently pushes back, clarifying that while some stories have been widely publicized, they don't represent everyone's reality. His tone remains calm, but there's a firmness in how he speaks, a clear intention to correct what he sees as an oversimplification. The other hosts begin to engage more actively at this point, some nodding in agreement with Culkin, others attempting to bridge the perspectives being presented. The conversation becomes less about a single question and more about an ongoing exchange of viewpoints. The pacing slows slightly as each person takes a bit more time to respond, aware that the discussion has moved into more sensitive territory. In the audience, the reaction is subtle but noticeable. The earlier laughter and light applause give way to quieter attentiveness. People are listening more closely now, picking up on the nuance in what's being said. It's the kind of shift that often happens during live television, not dramatic, but clearly felt. Behar, maintaining her role as both host and participant, presses a bit further. She rephrases her point, this time focusing more directly on Culkin's personal experience and how it aligns, or doesn't, with the broader narrative she's referencing. Her delivery remains controlled, but there's a persistence in her questioning that signals she's not ready to move on just yet. Culkin responds again, and this time his pushback is more defined. He emphasizes the importance of speaking from individual experience rather than relying on assumptions. There's no raised voice, no visible frustration, but the clarity in his words carries weight. He's not dismissing the topic. Rather, he's reframing it, bringing it back to a more personal and nuanced perspective. The dynamic at the table becomes more complex. One of the co-hosts briefly interjects, offering a comment that acknowledges both sides, attempting to ease the tension without shutting down the conversation. It's a common technique on shows like this, keeping the discussion moving while ensuring it doesn't become too one-sided. As the segment continues, The body language of everyone involved tells its own story. Behar leans forward slightly, maintaining eye contact, signaling engagement. Culkin sits steady, composed, but clearly attentive to every word. The other hosts shift subtly, some turning toward Culkin, others toward Behar, reflecting the balance of perspectives being presented. What stands out most is how controlled the exchange remains. There's no interruption that feels out of place, no escalation beyond what you might expect from a serious discussion. And yet, the tension is there, not in volume or tone, but in the underlying difference of opinion that neither side is fully stepping away from. By this point, the conversation has moved well beyond its original scope. What began as a reflection on a career has turned into a broader discussion about perception, experience, and how stories are told in the public space. It's the kind of shift that can only really happen in a live setting, where there's room for spontaneity and genuine reaction. As the segment approaches its midpoint, there's a brief pause, one of those natural breaks where it feels like the conversation could go in several directions. The audience remains quiet, the panel momentarily still, and the sense of anticipation becomes more noticeable. It's clear now that this isn't just a routine interview anymore. Something more meaningful is unfolding, shaped by the perspectives in the room and the willingness of both Culkin and Behar to engage with each other directly, even when they don't fully agree. And as the discussion continues, the question becomes not just what will be said next, but how far each side is willing to go in expressing their point, and whether the conversation can find common ground before the segment comes to a close. As the brief pause settles over the table, the conversation resumes with a slightly more deliberate rhythm, as if everyone involved recognizes that the tone has shifted and that each word now carries a bit more weight than it did just a few minutes earlier. Macaulay Culkin maintains his composed posture, his hands loosely folded, his expression attentive but firm. Across from him, Joy Behar continues to engage, her focus steady, clearly intent on exploring the point she had begun to raise before the pause. One of the co-hosts gently steps in, offering a brief observation meant to keep the discussion balanced. She references how conversations about early fame often become generalized, and suggests that perhaps what's being seen here is a difference between personal experience and public narrative. It's a subtle attempt to reframe the exchange in a way that allows both perspectives to exist without directly opposing one another. Culkin nods as she speaks, acknowledging the point, but when he begins his response, it becomes clear that he wants to go a step further. He explains that while public narratives can serve a purpose, they can also create assumptions that follow individuals long after their circumstances have changed. His voice remains even, but there's a clarity in how he articulates his thoughts, emphasizing that not every story fits the pattern people expect. Behar listens closely, but as soon as he finishes, she responds with a follow-up that brings the focus back to accountability. Not in an accusatory sense, but in a broader discussion about how industries evolve. She suggests that while individual experiences may differ, there are still systemic issues worth addressing, particularly when it comes to young performers. The exchange remains calm, but the contrast in their viewpoints becomes more defined. Culkin leans slightly forward now, a small shift that signals increased engagement. He agrees that systemic issues exist, but he draws a distinction between acknowledging those issues and allowing them to define every individual's story. It's a nuanced point, and he takes care to express it without dismissing the larger conversation. The audience, still quiet, begins to respond with small, scattered reactions, a few nods, a soft murmur here and there, the kind of subtle feedback that often accompanies more thoughtful discussions on live television. It's clear that viewers in the studio are following closely, recognizing that this is no longer just a casual interview. Another co-host joins in, this time posing a question to Culkin that shifts the angle slightly. She asks how he feels about being seen as a representative of a broader experience, whether he's comfortable with that role, or if it's something he actively resists. It's a question that adds another layer to the conversation, moving it from general discussion into something more personal again. Culkin takes a moment before answering, briefly glancing down as if organizing his thoughts. When he looks back up, his response is measured but direct. He explains that while he understands why people might look to him as an example, he doesn't believe it's fair or accurate to assume that his experience can stand in for others. He emphasizes the importance of individuality, noting that each person's journey through the industry is shaped by different circumstances. As he speaks, Behar watches intently, her expression thoughtful but still engaged. When he finishes, she nods slightly, acknowledging his point, but then offers a counter perspective. She suggests that public figures, whether they intend to or not, often become part of larger conversations simply because of their visibility. It's not necessarily about representing everyone, she explains, but about contributing to an ongoing dialogue. This is where the tension subtly deepens. Culkin doesn't interrupt, but when he responds, there's a noticeable firmness in his tone. Still calm, still respectful, but more defined than before. He clarifies that contributing to a dialogue is different from being framed within a narrative that doesn't fully align with reality. He points out that while discussions about systemic issues are important, they should be grounded in accurate representation rather than assumption. The pacing of the conversation slows again, each exchange followed by a brief pause, as if both sides are carefully considering how to proceed. The hosts around them remain attentive, occasionally offering small comments or gestures that signal support or understanding, but largely allowing the main exchange to unfold. At one point, a co-host lightly interjects with a comment meant to ease the intensity, referencing how conversations like this can be difficult but necessary. There's a small ripple of laughter from the audience, not because anything particularly humorous has been said, but because the remark provides a momentary release from the growing seriousness of the discussion. Culkin smiles briefly at that, a subtle acknowledgement, before returning to the conversation. His demeanor remains steady, but it's clear that he's fully engaged now, no longer just responding to questions, but actively shaping the direction of the discussion. Behar, too, maintains her focus, her questions becoming slightly more precise, aimed at clarifying rather than challenging outright. As the segment continues, the conversation begins to touch on how media coverage can influence public perception. Behar raises the point that certain narratives gain traction because they resonate with audiences, even if they don't apply universally. Culkin responds by agreeing in principle, but he adds that resonance shouldn't come at the expense of accuracy. There's a moment where both seem to recognize the core of their disagreement, not about whether the issues exist, but about how they are framed and discussed. It's a subtle but important distinction, and it shapes everything that follows. The audience remains engaged, their reactions measured but present. A few people nod in agreement at different points, others remain still, absorbing the conversation. The energy in the room is focused, attentive, and slightly tense, but not uncomfortable. The kind of atmosphere that comes from a discussion that matters. Toward the latter part of this stretch, one of the co-hosts attempts to steer the conversation toward resolution, asking both Culkin and Behar what they think is the most constructive way to approach these topics moving forward. It's a question that invites reflection rather than debate, and for a moment, it seems like the discussion might begin to settle. Culkin answers first, suggesting that open, honest conversations, ones that allow for different perspectives without forcing a single narrative, are the most productive. He emphasizes listening as much as speaking, a point that resonates with the tone he's maintained throughout. Behar follows, agreeing with the importance of dialogue, but reiterating her belief that broader issues shouldn't be minimized simply because individual experiences vary. Her response is measured, thoughtful, and consistent with the position she's held from the beginning. As both finish their thoughts, there's another brief pause. The conversation hasn't escalated, but it hasn't fully resolved either. Instead, it sits in that space where differing perspectives have been clearly expressed, each supported by reason and experience. And as the segment continues, it becomes clear that while the tone has remained calm and professional, the exchange has reached a point where something more decisive may be needed. Either a shift in direction or a deeper exploration of the disagreement that has quietly taken shape at the table. The moment lingers for just a second longer than usual, the kind of pause that feels natural to viewers but carries a bit more weight inside the studio. On The View, those pauses often signal a transition, either toward a lighter topic or a deeper dive into what's already been said. In this case, it becomes clear that the conversation isn't quite ready to move on. One of the co-hosts leans in slightly, her tone measured as she picks up on the question that had been left hanging in the air. She reframes it in a way that shifts the focus toward communication itself, how public conversations are shaped, and who ultimately controls the narrative. It's a subtle adjustment, but it opens the door for both Macaulay Culkin and Joy Behar to expand on their positions without directly repeating what's already been said. Culkin responds first, his voice steady and deliberate. He explains that one of the challenges of being in the public eye is that narratives can take on a life of their own, often independent of the person they're about. He emphasizes that while discussions about broader issues are important, they can sometimes overshadow the individual stories that don't fit neatly into those frameworks. His tone remains calm, but there's a quiet insistence in how he speaks, not defensive, but clearly invested in being understood. As he talks, his body language remains composed. He maintains eye contact with the panel, occasionally glancing toward the audience, as if acknowledging that this conversation extends beyond the table. There's a sense that he's not just responding to the hosts, but to the broader perception he's been addressing throughout the segment. Behar listens without interruption, her expression attentive, but as soon as he finishes, she steps back in. Her response is careful, but it carries a slightly more direct tone than before. She acknowledges his point about individuality, but then pivots to the idea that public conversations often rely on patterns because they help people understand larger trends. It's not presented as a dismissal of his perspective, but rather as an explanation of how these discussions tend to function. At this point, the contrast between them becomes more pronounced. Culkin leans forward just slightly, signaling that he wants to respond immediately. He doesn't raise his voice or interrupt, but when he begins speaking, there's a noticeable shift in emphasis. He clarifies that recognizing patterns is one thing, but applying them too broadly can lead to misunderstandings, especially when those patterns are treated as definitive rather than contextual. The exchange remains respectful, but the back and forth now has a sharper edge. Each response builds directly on the last, with less space between them. The pacing quickens just a bit, not in a rushed way, but in a way that reflects increased engagement from both sides. One of the co-hosts attempts to interject with a brief comment, but pauses when it becomes clear that Culkin is still making his point. He continues, explaining that he's not opposed to broader conversations. In fact, he supports them, but he believes they should leave room for exceptions and nuance. It's a point he's made before, but this time it comes across with more clarity and definition. Behar responds again, this time focusing on the role of media in shaping those conversations. She suggests that while nuance is important, media formats, especially live television, often require simplifying complex issues in order to make them accessible to a wide audience. It's a practical perspective, and one that reflects the realities of the format they're working within. Culkin acknowledges that reality with a small nod, but he doesn't fully concede the point. Instead, he points out that simplification doesn't have to mean distortion. His tone remains steady, but there's a firmness in how he frames the idea, drawing a clear line between making something understandable and misrepresenting it. The audience reaction at this stage becomes slightly more noticeable. There's a soft murmur of agreement from a few sections, followed by a brief moment of quiet. It's not disruptive, but it adds to the sense that the conversation has fully captured the room's attention. Another co-host steps in again, this time more decisively, offering a perspective that bridges both sides. She suggests that perhaps the real issue isn't whether narratives exist, but how they're communicated, whether they're presented as fixed truths or as starting points for discussion. It's a comment that seems to resonate with both Culkin and Behar, at least to some extent. Culkin responds first, agreeing that communication plays a key role. He adds that when people feel their experiences are being reduced or generalized, it can create a disconnect, not just between individuals and the media, but between different parts of the audience as well. His tone softens slightly here, shifting from firm clarification to something more reflective. Behar follows, acknowledging that point, and for a brief moment, the tension eases. She offers a small nod, indicating agreement, and the conversation seems to settle into a more balanced rhythm again. But the underlying difference in perspective hasn't disappeared. It's simply being expressed in a more measured way. As the discussion continues, the focus shifts slightly toward the responsibility of public figures in shaping these conversations. A co-host poses a question about whether individuals like Culkin feel a sense of obligation to speak out on broader issues, given their visibility. It's a question that brings the conversation back to a more personal level. Culkin takes a moment before answering, his expression thoughtful. He explains that while he understands the expectation, he believes that responsibility should come from a place of authenticity rather than obligation. He emphasizes that speaking on issues should be a choice, not something imposed by public perception. Behar listens closely, and when she responds, her tone is noticeably softer than before. She acknowledges that perspective, adding that authenticity is important in any public discussion. However, she also reiterates that visibility often comes with influence, whether it's intended or not. The exchange here feels less like a disagreement and more like a mutual exploration of the topic. The earlier tension hasn't completely disappeared, but it has evolved into something more nuanced, a conversation where both sides are actively listening, even as they maintain their own viewpoints. The pacing slows again, and the panel as a whole seems more relaxed. A few light comments are exchanged, and there's a brief moment of shared acknowledgement that the topic is complex and doesn't lend itself to simple answers. The audience responds with a small round of applause, not loud or overwhelming, but enough to signal appreciation for the discussion. As this portion of the segment comes to a close, it becomes clear that the conversation has reached a turning point. The initial tension has been addressed, not by resolving it completely, but by allowing it to evolve into a more constructive exchange. Still, there's a sense that the discussion isn't entirely finished. The questions that have been raised about narrative, representation, and responsibility remain open, and the way they've been explored suggests that there may be one more shift before the segment fully wraps. And as the hosts glance briefly at each other, preparing for what comes next, the audience remains attentive, aware that even in its calmer state, the conversation still carries a level of depth that could easily take another unexpected turn. As the conversation settles into a more measured pace, there's a noticeable shift in how everyone at the table is approaching the discussion. On The View, moments like this often mark the transition from direct back and forth into something more reflective, where each participant begins to step back slightly and consider the broader implications of what's been said. Macaulay Culkin sits back just a bit in his chair now, his posture still attentive but less forward than before. His expression remains calm, thoughtful, and composed. Across from him, Joy Behar mirrors that shift in a subtle way. Her tone, when she begins speaking again, is less pointed than earlier, still engaged, but more reflective than probing. She introduces a slightly different angle, moving away from the specifics of Culkin's experience and toward the role that conversations like this play for viewers at home. She notes that audiences often look to discussions on shows like this to better understand complicated issues, and she raises the question of whether disagreement itself can actually be productive in that context. It's a shift that reframes the entire exchange. Instead of focusing on who is right or wrong, the emphasis moves toward what the conversation is accomplishing. Culkin listens carefully, nodding once as she speaks, and when he responds, his tone aligns with that reframing. He acknowledges that disagreement, when handled respectfully, can be valuable. He points out that it allows different perspectives to be heard and can encourage people to think more critically about the topics being discussed. His voice remains steady, but there's a slight warmth in how he delivers this part of his response, as if recognizing that the conversation has reached a more constructive place. One of the co-hosts leans in with a small smile, adding that what viewers are seeing right now is a good example of that. A conversation that didn't avoid tension, but also didn't let it become unproductive. There's a light ripple of agreement around the table, and for the first time in a while, the atmosphere feels noticeably lighter. The audience responds as well, offering a brief round of applause. It's not loud or prolonged, but it signals appreciation for the tone the conversation has taken. Inside the studio, the energy shifts from focused tension to something more balanced and open. Behar nods at that reaction, then turns back to Culkin with a follow-up that feels less like a challenge and more like an invitation. She asks whether he believes conversations about the entertainment industry, particularly those involving young performers, have improved over time, and whether there's still work to be done. Culkin takes a moment before answering, glancing briefly toward the audience and then back to the panel. He explains that, in his view, there has been progress, particularly in how openly people are willing to discuss their experiences. At the same time, he adds that there's always room for improvement, especially when it comes to ensuring that those conversations remain accurate and inclusive of different perspectives. His answer is balanced, and it seems to resonate with the panel. Behar nods again, this time with a small smile, acknowledging the point without immediately offering a counterargument. It's a subtle but important change from earlier in the segment, where each response tended to lead directly into another challenge or clarification. Another co-host takes the opportunity to broaden the discussion slightly, bringing in the idea of how audiences interpret these conversations once they leave the studio. She mentions that viewers often take away different messages depending on their own experiences, and she asks both Culkin and Behar how they feel about that level of interpretation. Culkin responds by saying that interpretation is inevitable, but that clarity in communication can help guide those interpretations in a more accurate direction. He reiterates the importance of being mindful about how things are presented, especially in a format where there isn't always time to fully explore every nuance. Behar follows, agreeing with the importance of clarity, but adding that part of the role of a show like this is to spark ongoing conversations beyond the broadcast itself. She notes that not every discussion will reach a clear conclusion, and that sometimes the value lies in raising questions rather than answering them. As she speaks, there's a sense that the earlier tension has fully transitioned into mutual understanding. The disagreement hasn't disappeared, but it has been reframed as part of a larger, more constructive dialogue. The pacing of the segment slows again, with longer pauses between responses and more space for reflection. The hosts exchange brief glances with one another, signaling a shared awareness that the conversation is approaching its natural conclusion. At one point, Culkin offers a brief comment that feels almost like a summary of his perspective. He emphasizes that while public discussions are important, they should always leave room for individuality and complexity. It's a point he's made throughout the segment, but here it comes across as more reflective than corrective. Behar responds with a nod and a short acknowledgement, noting that complexity is often what makes these conversations meaningful, even when they're not easy. Her tone is calm, measured, and noticeably softer than at the start of the exchange. The audience reacts again, this time with a slightly stronger round of applause. It's clear that the shift in tone has resonated, and that the viewers in the studio appreciate the way the conversation has unfolded. As the segment nears its final moments, one of the co-hosts begins to steer things toward a close, offering a brief recap of the discussion and highlighting some of the key points that were raised. It's done in a way that feels natural, not forced, more like a reflection than a formal summary. Culkin listens, nodding occasionally, while Behar sits back slightly, her posture relaxed. The intensity that defined the earlier part of the segment has given way to a more composed, reflective atmosphere. Still, there's a sense that the conversation has left an impression, not just on the panel, but on the audience as well. The questions that were raised, the perspectives that were shared, and the way the disagreement was handled all contribute to that feeling. And as the hosts prepare to transition out of the segment, it becomes clear that while the discussion itself may be ending, its impact is likely to continue, both for those in the studio and for viewers watching from home, who will carry these ideas with them long after the broadcast moves on to its next topic. As the segment begins to wind down on The View, there's a subtle but clear shift in the rhythm of the conversation. The hosts begin to transition from open discussion into closing remarks, the kind that signal to both the audience and the viewers at home that the segment is coming to an end. The energy in the studio is noticeably calmer now, shaped by everything that has already been said. Macaulay Culkin sits with a relaxed posture, his earlier intensity softened into a more reflective presence. Across the table, Joy Behar also appears more at ease, her expression thoughtful rather than probing. What had started as a difference in perspective has, over the course of the conversation, turned into something more balanced. Not fully resolved, but clearly understood by both sides. One of the co-hosts offers a brief closing comment, thanking Culkin for his openness and for engaging in what she describes as a meaningful discussion. Her tone is warm, and it draws a small but genuine round of applause from the studio audience. It's the kind of reaction that reflects appreciation not just for the guest, but for the way the conversation unfolded. Culkin responds with a polite nod and a short remark of his own, expressing appreciation for the opportunity to have a conversation that goes beyond surface-level questions. His tone remains consistent with how he's carried himself throughout, calm, measured, and grounded. He doesn't revisit any specific points of disagreement, but his acknowledgement suggests that he values the exchange as a whole. Behar follows with a final comment, one that feels less like a continuation of the earlier debate and more like a closing reflection. She reiterates the importance of having conversations that allow for different perspectives, even when they don't fully align. There's a sense of mutual respect in her delivery, and it's met with another brief wave of audience approval. As the hosts begin to wrap the segment, there's a natural shift toward lighter closing remarks. A co-host briefly references some of Culkin's recent work, offering a quick mention that brings the focus back to his career in a more traditional talk show format. Culkin smiles at that, responding with a short, easygoing comment that lightens the mood just enough to create a smooth transition out of the heavier discussion. The audience reacts with a mix of light laughter and applause, the kind that signals a comfortable return to the show's usual tone. It's a noticeable contrast to the quieter, more focused reactions that filled the studio earlier, and it highlights just how much the conversation had shifted over the course of the segment. As the camera begins to pull back slightly, the hosts exchange a few final words with Culkin, thanking him again for joining the show. The moment feels natural and unforced, with no lingering tension visible in their interactions. Whatever differences were explored during the discussion have been left in a place of understanding rather than conflict. Once the segment ends and the show moves on, the immediate reaction inside the studio is one of steady applause. It's not overly enthusiastic, but it's consistent and appreciative. The kind of response that reflects a conversation well received rather than one that was purely entertaining. Outside the studio, the response begins to take shape almost immediately. Viewers watching from home start to share their reactions across social media, discussing the exchange between Culkin and Behar. Some highlight Culkin's emphasis on individuality and nuance, appreciating the way he calmly clarified his perspective. Others focus on Behar's points about broader narratives and the importance of addressing systemic issues, noting that her questions reflected concerns that resonate with many viewers. What stands out in the online discussion is that, much like the conversation itself, the reactions are varied but largely respectful. Rather than turning into a divisive moment, the segment becomes an example of how differing viewpoints can be expressed without escalating into something unproductive. Clips from the segment begin circulating, with particular attention given to the moments where Culkin gently pushed back and where Behar acknowledged his perspective. These clips are shared not as dramatic confrontations, but as examples of a thoughtful exchange, something that viewers don't always expect from daytime television. In the hours following the broadcast, a few media outlets pick up on the segment, offering brief recaps that highlight the key points of the discussion. The coverage remains consistent with the tone of the show itself, focusing on the conversation rather than framing it as a conflict. The emphasis is on the substance of what was said, rather than on any perceived tension. There are also follow-up discussions, both online and in commentary spaces, about the broader topics that were raised, how narratives are formed, how individual experiences are represented, and how public figures navigate those dynamics. In that sense, the segment achieves exactly what Behar had mentioned earlier. It sparks ongoing conversation beyond the broadcast. Back on the show, in the next episode, there's a brief reference to the previous day's discussion. One of the hosts acknowledges the viewer feedback, noting that many people appreciated the respectful tone of the exchange. It's not revisited in depth, but the acknowledgement reinforces the idea that the segment left an impression. For Culkin, the appearance is seen as another example of his more recent public persona. Thoughtful, composed, and willing to engage in meaningful conversation without leaning into dramatics. For Behar, it reinforces her role as a host who is willing to ask direct questions while still maintaining a level of respect for her guests. In the end, what remains most notable about the segment is not any single moment, but the way the conversation evolved. It began with a familiar topic, shifted into a moment of tension, and then gradually moved toward a more balanced and reflective discussion. It's a progression that feels authentic to live television, unscripted, occasionally uncertain, but ultimately grounded in real dialogue. And for viewers, that authenticity is what makes the segment stand out. It's not about who was right or wrong, but about how the conversation was handled, calmly, respectfully, and with a willingness to engage rather than avoid disagreement. As the episode fades into its final moments and transitions to the next segment, the impact of that exchange lingers just a bit longer than usual, carried not by volume or drama, but by the clarity and honesty of what was shared. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.